He held the solid oak chair above his head, muscles straining against the fabric of his tailored Tom Ford suit, ready to bring it crashing down on the trembling manager's skull. The entire dining room of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, the Obsidian Room, held its breath. This wasn't just a drunk patron causing a scene. This was Dominic Valentino, 37 years old, the ruthless heir known as the Butcher of Brooklyn, the undisputed king of the East Coast's most violent crime empire. One wrong move meant death. Security looked away. Billionaires cowered beneath their tables, their $1,000 meals forgotten. But in that deafening silence, the soft chime of silver striking porcelain pierced the air. A waitress, pale and terrified, walked straight into the kill zone. She was 28, exhausted from working 3 jobs, haunted by $200,000 in medical debt, and she hadn't eaten in 2 days. She couldn't afford to get fired tonight. She couldn't afford to get shot either, but she also couldn't watch a man die. She didn't have a weapon. She had a napkin and a terrifying secret that Dominic thought no one else saw. His right hand was shaking uncontrollably, a violent tremor he was desperately trying to hide behind his rage. What she did next didn't just save the restaurant. It ignited a war that would burn the entire city to the ground. If you loved this story, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a good Mafia twist. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what happens next. The sound of the oak chair slamming toward the floor exploded like thunder, but it did not strike Henry's head, because at the very last second, Dominic hurled it aside, the heavy chair flying through the air and crashing straight into the glass wine display, where hundreds of bottles of expensive wine shattered at once, red liquid pouring down like a waterfall of blood across a Persian carpet worth a small fortune. As Henry collapsed to his knees, hands clasped together in desperate supplication, tears and mucus streaming down a face that had always looked down on his staff with arrogance, a man of 52 years, who had ruled this restaurant for 20 years through pride and contempt, now trembling like a worm beneath Dominic's heel, begging in a broken voice, "Sir Valentino, I swear to you, that truly is a bottle of Chateau Margaux from 1996. We would never dare deceive you." Yet Dominic did not even look down because his attention was fixed elsewhere, on his right hand, which had begun to tremble again, small spasms creeping from his fingers to his wrist and up his forearm, as he pulled a gold Zippo lighter from his pocket and tried to spark a flame for his cigarette, only for his thumb to refuse to cooperate, the flame failing again and again, each failed strike cutting into his pride like a blade, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning of the dining room, his eyes flicking sideways to see them watching. Financial titans, diamond-laden wives, the most powerful people in New York witnessing his handshake, knowing the rumors would spread before dawn, that the Butcher of Brooklyn was no longer steady, that rival families would smell blood, that Uncle Salvatore would laugh in his face. No, it could not be allowed. No one could see. So Dominic hurled the Zippo to the floor and kicked it away, then swept his right arm across the nearest table, porcelain plates, crystal glasses, silver candlesticks crashing down in a deafening clatter, manufactured fury, becoming the perfect curtain to hide the tremor, as he overturned another table and kicked over another chair, roaring curses in Italian his father had once taught him, while the bodyguards stood frozen like stone statues, eyes straight ahead, none daring to intervene because they knew the rule. Never touch the late Don Valentino's son unless he gives the order. And in the corner of the service area, Elena Cross stood pressed behind a silk screen, clutching a silver water pitcher to her chest. Having worked at the Obsidian Room for 8 months, long enough to know when to turn herself into a ghost, tonight she should have earned at least $300 in tips from wealthy patrons, enough to buy 2 weeks of immunosuppressant medication for Sophia. But now no one had the presence of mind to tip a server. And as she watched Dominic tear the room apart like a wounded animal, she saw what no one else did. Not rage, not brutality, but fear. His eyes, amid the growls and violent blows, wild with the desperation of someone cornered. And his right hand, the hand he kept hiding behind his back, or clenching into a fist. That hand was shaking, not with anger but with the pathological tremor she had seen in Parkinson's patients she cared for during weekend work. And Elena drew in a deep breath, thinking of Sophia lying in the hospital waiting for surgery, thinking of the $50,000 bill, thinking that if she lost her job tonight everything would collapse. But then she saw Henry kneeling at Dominic's feet, and saw Dominic reaching for the second oak chair, knowing this time he would not miss, and Elena stepped out of the darkness. Elena's footsteps echoed through the deadly silence, the cheap heels striking the marble floor with a steady rhythm, like a countdown to an execution. And the entire dining room held its breath as they watched her, even Henry, still kneeling on the floor, lifting his head with eyes wide in horror. "You're insane. Go back right now," he hissed through clenched teeth. But Elena did not slow, did not hesitate, walking straight toward Dominic without looking at the oak chair in his hand, without looking at the shattered glass beneath her feet, looking only at his right hand clenched around the chair back so tightly the knuckles had gone white, a hand that was still trembling no matter how hard he tried to control it. And Dominic spun around when the footsteps came too close, his eyes black as obsidian and cold as ice, locking onto Elena with the fury of a beast whose territory had been violated. "Who are you?" he roared, his voice so deep it seemed to shake the air itself. "Did I tell you to come here? Get out now before I change my mind about the manager's head." As one of the bodyguards drew his gun, finger resting on the trigger ready to fire if Dominic signaled, and Elena felt the barrel aimed at her back, but did not turn around. She had gone too far to stop now. And more than that, she had seen what she needed to see, because Dominic's hand shook even more violently as he shouted, as if the rage itself were worsening the condition. And instead of answering him, Elena did something no one in that room would have dared to imagine, not even in their most reckless dreams. She reached out with both hands and took hold of the trembling right hand of Dominic Valentino, a collective gasp rippling through the room, as though the oxygen had been sucked from the air, the bodyguard stepping forward with the gun raised higher, while Dominic froze, his entire body taut as a drawn wire, eyes wide as he stared down at her small hands enclosing his, because no one touched Dominic Valentino without permission. No one. Yet Elena did not let go, her cool hands wrapping around his fist as she pressed into pressure points she had learned during years of caring for elderly patients with Parkinson's disease, her thumb pressing into the center of the back of his hand while her other fingers gently massaged his wrist, just enough force to stimulate the nerves without causing pain, and she felt the tremor beneath her palms, violent and uncontrollable, knowing this was not shaking from rage or intoxication, but pathological tremor. "You are hypoglycemic," she said, her voice strangely calm amid the storm. Not whispering yet, not shouting, just loud enough for the nearby bodyguards to hear while still intimate enough to sound private. "You drank alcohol without eating, and the adrenaline from your anger caused your blood sugar to drop suddenly. That is why your hand is shaking. You need sugar right now." And Dominic looked at her as if she had grown a second head, because he knew she was lying. He knew this tremor was not from low blood sugar, but from nerve damage caused by the car bomb 4 months earlier. Yet he also understood exactly what she was doing. She was giving him an excuse, an explanation the room could accept, a curtain to hide the weakness he believed had already been exposed. "Sit down, sir," Elena continued, still holding his hand as she began guiding him toward an intact booth in the corner. And she walked and he followed as if she were the guide, and he the one who had lost his way. The bodyguards staring in disbelief, unsure what to do as their boss was led away by a thin waitress like a child. And Dominic sat down not because she commanded it but because he needed to, his legs beginning to weaken, and his head spinning not from blood sugar, but from the sheer absurdity of the moment. And Elena turned to another server standing frozen nearby and said, "Bring chocolate mousse here now." Her voice sharp as a blade, no longer the voice of a waitress but that of a nurse handling an emergency, and a glass of warm water. "Hurry," the server bolting away as if chased, and 30 seconds later, a bowl of chocolate mousse was placed in front of Dominic. Elena pressing the silver spoon into his left hand, the one he could still control. "Eat," she said gently but without asking. "The sugar will stabilize you within a minute." And Dominic stared at her for a long moment, his eyes no longer angry but calculating, assessing, like a panther deciding whether what stood before it was prey or threat. And then he lifted the spoon and ate, the tremor in his right hand gradually easing beneath the steady pressure of Elena's hands still holding on. Dominic finished the bowl of chocolate mousse in silence, spoon by spoon, slow and deliberate, as though he were performing a ritual rather than eating, the tremor in his right hand now fully subdued beneath the steady pressure of Elena's hands, and he could feel his heartbeat easing from a frantic gallop back into a normal rhythm, until he set the spoon down, looked at his hand, opened it and closed it again, perfectly steady, and then for the first time truly looked at Elena, not with the gaze of a predator assessing prey, but with the look of a man trying to solve a complicated puzzle. Seeing a girl so thin her collarbones stood out sharply beneath the white uniform shirt, its collar frayed and crudely mended with thread the wrong color, a small detail his trained eye could not miss. dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep, cheeks hollow as if she had not eaten a proper meal in days. Yet her eyes, those hazel eyes, held no fear or pleading like everyone else in the room. They were calm, alert, and hardened like tempered steel. "What is your name?" Dominic asked, his voice no longer a growl but low and even, like water moving beneath ice. "Elena," she answered, and he noticed how she clutched the silver tray to her chest like a shield, noticing too that she was trembling, though she hid it far better than he ever had. "Elena Cross," and Dominic nodded slowly as if carving the name into his memory with an iron stylus, then swept his gaze around the dining room, taking in the wreckage he had caused, Henry still kneeling on the floor like a frozen statue, the elite guests peering fearfully from beneath tables, and suddenly he felt tired, not in body but in spirit, a weariness that had been accumulating for 4 months since the bombing. So he stood, adjusted the cuff of his Tom Ford jacket as if nothing had happened, the bodyguards immediately flanking him, and reached into his inner pocket to pull out a thick wad of cash, bound by a gold clip, engraved with the letter V, not bothering to count as he peeled off a fistful of $100 bills and let them fall onto the chocolate-smeared table, $5,000 drifting down like autumn leaves, more than Elena earned in 2 months of grueling work, for the damages, Dominic said to Henry without taking his eyes off her, then withdrew another stack, thicker than the first, and set it separately in front of her. "And this is for the medical advice," tilting his head slightly as a smile thin as a blade appeared on his lips. "I will remember you, Elena Cross," a sentence that was not thanks but a promise, or perhaps a threat, she could not be sure. As Dominic turned and walked away, his entourage following like silent shadows, pausing for a single second beside Henry to say coldly that next time he should ensure the wine served was without issue, because he did not wish to return for the same reason, before disappearing through the glass doors and leaving behind a ruined restaurant and a silence heavy as lead, no one moving until the sound of the Maybach engine roared to life and faded into the distance. Henry the first to stand with legs shaking like reeds in the wind, looking at Elena with an expression tangled between gratitude for saving his life, resentment for daring what he could not, and fear, because she had now entered the sights of Dominic Valentino, beginning to speak before giving up, shaking his head and walking away to supervise the cleanup, while Elena looked down at the money on the table, her hands still trembling slightly as she picked up each bill and counted. $10,000. Enough to buy Sophia's medication for months, enough to pay part of the hospital debt, enough for her to breathe freely for the first time in years. Yet as she slipped the money into her apron pocket, her fingers brushed a business card she did not remember receiving, bearing only a name, Dominic Valentino, and a handwritten line in black ink saying, "We will meet again." And Elena stared at the card for a long time, knowing that tonight was not an ending, but the beginning of something she could not yet understand. 12 hours before Elena stepped into Dominic Valentino's killing ground, she woke at 4:30 in the morning in a squalid studio apartment in the South Bronx, a room barely 200 square feet wide with walls stained by creeping mold, a window that squealed whenever the wind blew, and a heating system that had been broken since last winter, sleeping on a thin mattress laid directly on the floor because the bed had been sold 3 months earlier to pay for medicine, rising in the darkness without turning on the light because the electricity had been cut the previous week, after she fell 2 months behind on the bill, the only light seeping through the filthy window from a street lamp outside, just enough to guide her to the bathroom, where icy water poured over her because the water heater no longer worked either, something Elena had long since grown used to, just as she had grown used to everything cruel life had thrown at her since the night 12 years earlier, when police knocked on her door to tell her that her parents had died in a car accident on the highway. Elena only 16 then and Sophia just 8, with no relatives willing to take them in. No savings, nothing but a rented apartment and a mountain of bills, forcing Elena to grow up overnight, to drop out of high school, to work, then study for equivalency exams while raising her sister, fighting the welfare system tooth and nail so they would not be separated, somehow succeeding in keeping Sophia with her and even enrolling in nursing school, until Sophia became ill, systemic lupus erythematosus, the doctors said when Sophia was 14, an autoimmune disease that made her body attack itself, her kidneys beginning to fail, requiring dialysis 3 times a week, expensive immunosuppressants, tests and treatments insurance would not fully cover, prompting Elena to quit nursing school in her 2nd year to work full-time, then 2 jobs, then 3, cleaning office buildings at 5 in the morning, caring for the elderly at a nursing home during the day, serving nights at the Obsidian Room, sleeping 4 hours a day if lucky, eating one meal if she had money, and still, it was never enough. Sophia's medical bills alone, $15,000 a month, not counting emergency hospitalizations that could reach tens of thousands more. Rent, food, transportation, medication, all piling together like a bottomless monster devouring every cent Elena earned, forcing her into debt, hospital debt, rent debt, credit card debt, debts upon debts, until the number reached $200,000, and collection calls became the soundtrack of her life. And then came Michael, appearing like a savior, a polished banker she met at the nursing home where she cared for his grandmother, whispering sweet promises, vowing to help restructure her debt, to take care of everything. And Elena was not naive, but she was exhausted, unbearably lonely, desperate for someone to lean on, handing him $12,000, every cent she had saved over 5 years, by selling plasma twice a week, by skipping meals, by selling every possession she owned, only for Michael to vanish overnight with the money, later discovering he had scammed at least 5 other women the same way. And she never went to the police because she had no time, no energy, no faith that anyone would help. And that morning, while mopping the gleaming floor of an insurance company on Madison Avenue, her phone vibrated, Mount Sinai Hospital calling with a nurse's cool professional voice to inform her that Sophia's condition had deteriorated severely, that she needed an urgent kidney transplant within a month, requiring a $50,000 deposit before they would place her on the waiting list. $50,000. And Elena stood there on the polished floor holding the mop and did not cry, having forgotten how long ago, staring into empty space and calculating 3 jobs bringing in about $4,000 a month, minus rent, food, transportation leaving almost nothing, tips from the obsidian room, maybe another $2,000 if she was lucky, still not enough, never enough. Thinking briefly of selling a kidney, but remembering she had only one healthy kidney left after donating the other to a stranger 2 years earlier to pay debts. Thinking of selling everything else, but realizing she had nothing left to sell except herself. And that evening, when Elena arrived at the obsidian room with swollen feet, after standing 14 straight hours, she had no idea she was about to meet Dominic Valentino, no idea she was about to step into a killing ground, knowing only that she needed tips that night, every possible dollar. Because Sophia was lying in a hospital bed waiting for a miracle Elena did not know where to find, and when she saw Dominic Valentino raise an oak chair to smash Henry's head, when she saw his trembling hand, she did not think about dying. She thought about Sophia, about $50,000, about who would take care of her sister if she were gone, and then she stepped out of the darkness. Not because she was brave, but because she had nothing left to lose. That night Dominic could not sleep, sitting alone in the pitch-dark penthouse on the top floor of the Manhattan building he owned, a glass of whiskey in his left hand, and his right hand resting on his thigh, the tremor returning the moment he stepped into the car, leaving the restaurant, more violent than before, as if his body were punishing him for suppressing it too long, because 4 months earlier his car had exploded just as he stepped out, the blast hurling him nearly 10 yards and driving shards of metal deep into his right arm. Surgeons telling him he was lucky to be alive, but that the nerves had been permanently damaged, that his hand would shake uncontrollably, especially under stress or exhaustion. A death sentence for a Mafia boss. 3 doctors had known about his condition, and those 3 doctors had died in separate accidents within a month afterward. No one was allowed to know Dominic Valentino was weakening. No one was allowed to see him tremble like an old man. No one except the nameless waitress tonight who had seen through him in a single instant. As Dominic raised the whiskey to his lips without drinking, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. Elena Cross, the name looping through his mind like a haunting refrain. What had she done? She had only taken his hand and lied, and yet he had obeyed like a well-trained dog. He, the butcher of Brooklyn, the man who made the entire city tremble, had let a thin girl lead him to sit down and eat chocolate in front of dozens of witnesses, something that should have enraged him, that should have made him order her silenced as a dangerous witness. Yet instead he felt curiosity, an irritating, persistent curiosity. Why was she not afraid? Everyone feared him, from rival bosses to cold-blooded killers, yet that girl had walked straight into the jaws of death without shaking. Her eyes, he remembered, those hazel eyes, had looked at him not with fear but with something like understanding. She had seen him tremble, and she had not stepped back. And so he picked up the phone and called Tony Russo, his most loyal bodyguard who had served his father before serving him, telling him to find out everything about the waitress tonight, Elena Cross, to learn where she lived, what she did, who she had, how much she owed, and why she was not afraid of dying, demanding the report before dawn. And 4 hours later, Tony returned with a thick file, the scarred 45-year-old man standing before Dominic and reading, Elena Cross, 28 years old, orphaned at 16. One sister named Sophia, 20 years old, diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus and currently hospitalized at Mount Sinai, works 3 jobs, office cleaning at 5 in the morning, elderly care during the day, restaurant service at night, income around $4,000 a month, sister's medical expenses, $15,000 a month, hospital debt $200,000, credit card debt $30,000, currently facing collection lawsuits, lives in a studio apartment in the South Bronx with electricity and hot water shut off, recently defrauded of $12,000 in savings by a boyfriend. Tony pausing before adding one more detail, that she had donated 1 kidney 2 years earlier to pay debts, and over the past year had sold plasma twice a week, the maximum allowed, to earn money for her sister's medication. And Dominic sat in silence for a long time afterward, looking down at his right hand, trembling faintly, then out the window where dawn was breaking over the Manhattan skyline, whispering to himself that she was not afraid of death because she had nothing left to lose. Her life already a hell where a bullet might feel like release, something that should have made him despise her as he despised other weak souls, yet instead stirred something unfamiliar within him. Not pity, because Dominic Valentino did not feel pity, but curiosity mixed with something he could not name, and he finally gave a quiet order to continue watching her, to report every move, and to make sure she never knew. 3 days after that fateful night, Elena came to the obsidian room as she always did, her feet still swollen inside cheap flat shoes, and her body still drained after 14 straight hours of work, having just finished her shift at the nursing home, where she had to lift an elderly man who fell in the bathroom, leaving her back aching so badly it stole her breath. Yet she came anyway because she needed tips that night, because Sophia needed her medication, because the $50,000 surgical deposit still hovered above her like a blade waiting to fall. And the moment she stepped through the staff entrance, Henry was already there, his face cold as ice, and his eyes fixed on her with a smug satisfaction hidden beneath a mask of false authority. "Go to my office, Cross," he said curtly before turning away without waiting for an answer, and Elena followed with a bad feeling rising in her chest, into a small but ostentatiously decorated office, lined with framed certificates and photographs of Henry posing with celebrities, where he sat behind his desk without inviting her to sit, and said flatly that she was fired, citing interference with a VIP guest and violation of service rules, telling her she would be paid through the end of the previous day and receive no reference, and Elena stood there feeling as if she had been punched in the stomach, knowing this was retaliation, knowing Henry despised her because she had done what he dared not, because she had seen him kneeling and begging like a worm, because she had walked away with $10,000 in tips while he was left with nothing but humiliation. Yet she did not beg, having not begged since she was 16 and refusing to start now, silently removing her apron, placing it on his desk, and walking out without a word, standing moments later on a Manhattan sidewalk in the cold November wind trying to calculate, realizing that losing the obsidian room meant losing at least $2,000 in monthly tips, her largest source of income, leaving her other 2 jobs barely enough to cover rent and food with nothing left for Sophia's medication, let alone the $50,000 deposit, and she began walking toward the subway because she could not afford a taxi when her phone vibrated in her pocket, the number from Mount Sinai Hospital tightening her chest as she answered to hear a nurse's urgent voice, saying that her sister was in severe pain and vomiting blood, and that she needed to come immediately. And Elena ran, not walked, ran down the subway stairs, through crowded corridors, running as if her own life were hanging by a thread, arriving at the hospital 45 minutes later, soaked in sweat and gasping for air to find Sophia on an emergency bed, her small face pale as paper, IV lines for fluids and blood piercing her thin arms. A girl only 20 years old who looked 15 because the illness had ravaged her for 6 years, eating away at her body day by day, whispering weakly when she saw Elena that she was sorry and had not meant to trouble her, and Elena gripped her hand and swallowed her tears, telling her softly not to say that she was not a burden, that her sister was here and would take care of everything, even as her own heart shattered, though she had no idea how to do so. And when the attending physician called her into the hallway with a cool professional expression to say that Sophia's condition was deteriorating faster than expected, that surgery needed to happen within 2 weeks instead of a month, and that the hospital required a $5,000 deposit immediately to continue treatment, or they would be forced to move Sophia to palliative care rather than intensive treatment, Elena knew exactly what palliative care meant, that it meant the hospital had given up, that they were simply waiting for Sophia to die. $5,000 she did not have, the $10,000 from Dominic's tip already spent on rent arrears and this month's medication, leaving her with less than $200 in her account, and she sat down on a cold plastic chair in the hospital corridor at 3 a.m, staring into nothing, her body unfed for 2 days, her stomach twisting with hunger she could barely feel, aware only of the desperation crushing her chest like an invisible hand. And for the first time in 12 years since the night her parents died, Elena Cross nearly cried, tears burning at her lashes as she clenched her teeth to keep them from falling because she could not afford to cry, could not afford to be weak, because if she broke, then who would take care of Sophia? And she sat there until dawn as the first light filtered through the hospital windows, and still she had no answer. Thinking of selling her last remaining kidney, even knowing it would kill her. Thinking of selling her body, her blood, anything that could be sold. But $5,000 in a single day was impossible, and $50,000 in 2 weeks was farther away than any dream. At 7 a.m, while Elena still sat motionless on the plastic chair outside the corridor like a forgotten statue, a nurse approached and called her name. "Mrs. Cross, please follow me to the billing office," the middle-aged woman said with an expression she could not quite hide, and Elena rose on numb legs, her heart pounding in fear that they were about to demand more money or announce the suspension of treatment, following the nurse through stark white hallways, thick with the smell of antiseptic, until they stopped at the financial services counter, where the staff looked at her with an odd mixture of curiosity and respect. "Mrs. Cross," the woman behind the desk said, "all medical expenses for patient Sophia Cross have been paid in full this morning, including the $50,000 surgical deposit and outstanding prior balances, totaling $120,000. And for a moment Elena thought she had misheard, standing there stunned, struggling to process the words. "Who?" she asked hoarsely after hours of silence. "Who paid? The payer has requested anonymity," the clerk replied. "But I am authorized to inform you that your sister has been transferred to the VIP ward on the 12th floor, and will now have a dedicated specialist overseeing her care." And Elena ran for the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs, finding the VIP room nothing like the cramped ward Sophia had occupied before, spacious and bright with a window overlooking Central Park, the most advanced hospital bed, and a fresh bouquet of flowers on the bedside table. Sophia sleeping peacefully, her face no longer twisted with pain but strangely serene, the heart monitor beating in a steady rhythm. A doctor Elena had never seen before, reviewing the chart with focused calm. "Everything will be all right, Mrs. Cross," the doctor said gently when he noticed her at the door. "Your sister is receiving the best care possible. Please rest assured." And Elena backed out into the hallway, her mind spinning, because she did not believe in miracles, not after 28 years of life without a single one, knowing that everything had a price, and whoever had just paid $170,000 for her sister would surely demand something in return, and she rushed toward the hospital's main entrance, pushing through the automatic glass doors only to freeze at the sight of a glossy black Maybach parked directly outside, beside it standing a tall man with a scarred face she recognized instantly. Tony Russo, Dominic Valentino's bodyguard who had stood behind his boss that night at the Obsidian Room. Tony nodded politely without warmth. "Mrs. Cross, my employer would like to see you," he said as he opened the rear door of the car, and Elena looked inside to see Dominic Valentino seated in the shadowed back seat, his face half lit and half concealed like a study in light and darkness, his eyes fixed on her, cold and unreadable as they had been that night. "Get in, Elena," Dominic said, his voice low and leaving no room for refusal. "We need to talk." And Elena stood still as every instinct screamed at her to run, to stay away from that car, to remember that nothing in this world was free, least of all anything given by a Mafia boss. But then she thought of Sophia resting in a VIP room under specialist care, of the surgery that would now happen, of the hope she had thought dead now breathing again, and she understood she had no choice. She never had. "What do you want?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt. And Dominic tilted his head, a smile thin as a blade cutting across his lips. "Get in and you will find out," he replied, and Elena looked back once more at the hospital, up toward the 12th floor where her sister lay, drew a deep breath, and stepped into the car, the door closing behind her with a soft, decisive click like the lock of a handcuff, as the Maybach pulled away, and Elena sat across from the devil, her heart pounding like a war drum, unsure whether she had just entered hell or paradise. The Maybach glided smoothly through the streets of Manhattan in a heavy, oppressive silence. Elena sitting across from Dominic and forcing her face into stillness, while her heart hammered wildly in her chest as he said nothing and merely fixed her with those obsidian black eyes, a silence far more terrifying than any spoken threat, and she noticed his right hand resting on his thigh, the fingers slightly curled as if restraining something, knowing the tremor was still there, hidden beneath a shell of practiced calm, until the car stopped before a towering skyscraper on the Upper East Side, a building whose very facade announced apartments worth tens of millions, Tony opening the door as Dominic stepped out first, not looking back but signaling for Elena to follow with a brief nod, leading her through a white marble lobby where security staff bowed to Dominic like subjects before a king, into a private elevator secured by fingerprint access, rising to the top floor where the doors opened, and Elena had to fight the urge to gape at the sight before her. Dominic Valentino's penthouse spread out like a palace in the sky, floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealing all of Manhattan bathed in morning light, minimalist furnishings of staggering cost. Every piece radiating power and wealth so dense it felt suffocating. And Elena glanced around thinking of her mold-stained studio in the South Bronx, of nights sleeping on a floor mattress in darkness after the electricity was cut, feeling as though she had crossed into a world she did not belong to. "Sit down," Dominic said, pointing to a black leather sofa in the center of the living room, not joining her but moving to the bar to pour himself a whiskey with his left hand before standing by the window overlooking the city. "You know why you are here," he said, his tone, not a question, and Elena looked at his back, at the tall silhouette against the blue sky. "Because you paid my sister's hospital bills," she answered, "and you want something in return," and Dominic turned with a thin smile that suggested approval at her lack of naivety, walking back to sit opposite her, setting the whiskey down and meeting her gaze directly. "You saw something no one is allowed to see," he said bluntly. "My hand shakes. A secret I have killed to keep hidden. You understand what that means," and Elena did understand, understanding that she should have died that night simply for witnessing his weakness. Yet she was still here, still breathing, her heart still beating, which meant he wanted something from her more than her death. "Why did you not kill me?" she asked, and Dominic tilted his head as if appraising an enigmatic work of art. "Because you did not run," he replied. "Because you saw me tremble and instead of fear you took my hand. Because you lied to an entire room to save my dignity without being asked," pausing to take a sip of whiskey, before adding that she was the only person in 10 years who had calmed his tremor, and Elena remembered that moment when she applied pressure point techniques learned from caring for Parkinson's patients, never believing they truly worked, acting on instinct alone. Yet he said they did, and that was why she lived. "I need a personal nurse," Dominic continued, his voice turning cold and transactional like a business negotiation. "Someone with me 24 hours a day, treating this tremor in complete secrecy and keeping silent about everything she sees or hears. You will live here in this penthouse, and you will not leave without my permission. You will have no contact with the outside world unless supervised." And Elena felt as if icy water had been poured over her, realizing this was not employment but imprisonment. A gilded cage, still a cage, and if I refuse, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dominic's eyes darkened, and for a fleeting second she glimpsed the monster behind the cultivated mask. "You know too much, Elena," he said slowly. "There is no refusal. Either you work for me or you disappear, and your sister returns to palliative care before sunset today." And Elena felt her blood turn to ice as he threatened not just her but Sophia, the only person she had left. Knowing he was not bluffing, a Mafia boss who had killed 3 doctors to protect a secret would not hesitate to erase a waitress and her sick sister. Yet Dominic shifted his tone, understanding that the stick must come with a carrot. "In return," he said, "all of Sophia's medical expenses will be covered indefinitely. She will have the best doctors, the finest medication, and that VIP room until she is fully recovered. You will be paid $50,000 a month, 10 times what you earned working 3 jobs combined. And when Sophia is discharged, I will provide her with a secure apartment on the Upper West Side with round-the-clock protection." And Elena heard the numbers and felt her head spin. $50,000 a month, unlimited medical care, a safe home for Sophia, everything she had ever dreamed of, everything she had prayed for through endless nights of despair, laid before her like a lavish feast, the price only her soul. And she looked at Dominic, into eyes devoid of mercy, knowing he cared nothing for her or Sophia, only for his secret and his invincible image, seeing herself as a tool, a brace for his trembling hand. Yet she thought of Sophia, of the trust in her sister's eyes whenever Elena promised to take care of everything, of her dreams of college, of the future she deserved, and she knew that even if this was a bargain with the devil, she would sign it in blood if required. "I agree," Elena said, her voice steady despite her heart breaking apart, and Dominic nodded, neither surprised nor pleased, merely accepting as if he had always known. "Tony will take you to collect your belongings and say goodbye to your sister," he said, standing. "You have 2 hours. After that you belong to me," and Elena watched him disappear into his study, the door closing behind him, leaving her alone in the luxurious penthouse, with the crushing sense that she had just signed her own life sentence, having sold her soul to the devil and left to pray that the price would not one day exceed what she could endure. The first week inside Dominic Valentino's penthouse passed like a strange dream that Elena could not tell was a nightmare or a paradise, as she was assigned a private room 3 times the size of her old studio in the South Bronx, complete with a king-size bed dressed in white silk sheets, a marble-lined private bathroom, and a wardrobe filled with new clothes Tony had purchased in her exact measurements, though she had no idea how they obtained them, and for the first time in many years, she slept in a real bed, bathed in hot water, and opened a refrigerator stocked with food. Yet she did not allow herself comfort, reminding herself every day that this was a cage, and a gilded cage was still a cage, that she was a prisoner, not a guest, keeping an absolutely professional distance from Dominic, arriving at his office every morning at 7 for the first treatment session, massaging pressure points along his arm and right hand, guiding him through nerve rehabilitation exercises she had studied through the night, from medical texts in the penthouse library, returning again at 5 in the afternoon to repeat the routine, applying acupuncture with a kit Tony had purchased at her request, recording his progress in a small notebook, speaking only about treatment, never asking questions, never showing curiosity, never revealing emotion, because he was the patient and she was the nurse, and that boundary was not one she intended to cross. And Dominic showed no interest in familiarity either, treating her like a useful instrument, issuing curt orders, never saying thank you, and for most of the time behaving as though she did not exist, meeting with frightening men behind closed doors, leaving at unpredictable hours, returning with faint traces of gunpowder or blood on his suit jacket that she forced herself not to think about. Yet Elena was an observer, having survived 28 years by reading what others did not say, and she began to notice things about Dominic that no one else seemed to see, that he suffered nightmares every night. The first night she heard a scream from his room at 2 in the morning, and nearly rushed out thinking there was an intruder before realizing it was Dominic shouting in his sleep. The following nights the screams became a grim soundtrack, sometimes curses in Italian, sometimes choking gasps as if someone were squeezing his throat, sometimes the sound of him calling a name she could not make out, and every morning he rose with dark circles beneath his eyes, and a fatigue he concealed beneath ruthless coldness. Though Elena saw it clearly, noticing too that he barely ate, the penthouse refrigerator always full of premium food that went untouched, Dominic living on whiskey and black coffee, occasionally swallowing a few bites of bread or fruit when Tony forced him, and when Elena asked why there was no chef, Tony replied with a puzzled expression that the boss trusted no one enough to let them cook for him, since a chef had been bribed to poison his food 3 years earlier, after which Dominic ate only sealed items or food he opened himself and had no time to cook. And on the 5th day, Elena stood in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, staring at the untouched fresh ingredients, and made a decision. Unsure why she did it, perhaps because caregiving instinct had been carved into her blood after years of raising her sister and caring for the elderly. Perhaps because she could not watch someone destroy themselves without intervening, and she cooked a simple bowl of chicken porridge, the kind she used to make for Sophia when she was sick, nourishing and easy to digest, placing the steaming bowl on Dominic's desk while he was in a video meeting without a word, without waiting for a reaction, simply setting it down and leaving, and he did not look at her or thank her, continuing his meeting as if she were a ghost. Yet when she returned an hour later to clean up, the bowl was empty, scraped clean, and Elena said nothing, quietly washing it and putting it away, cooking vegetable soup the next day, then pasta, then fried rice, leaving food on his desk each day, and finding the dishes returned spotless each time, no thanks spoken, no acknowledgement given. Yet Elena noticed the exhaustion easing from Dominic's face, and the tremor in his hand seeming more stable, and on Saturday night she was allowed to make a supervised video call to Sophia under Tony's watch, her sister visibly stronger, Color returned to her cheeks as she excitedly described the VIP room like a 5-star hotel, asking where Elena was and why she had not come to visit, and Elena swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady, as she explained she had a new job with very good pay and would be busy for a while, but would visit as soon as possible. And Sophia smiled, a smile Elena had not seen in months because pain had consumed her, saying she trusted her sister because Elena always found a way. And when the call ended, Elena sat alone in her room, looking out at Manhattan glittering with lights, wondering where she stood on the line between prisoner and guest, between servant and employee, between hatred and something else she did not yet dare to name. On the 12th night, Dominic's screaming tore through the penthouse more violently than on any night before, as Elena lay on her bed reading a medical text on neurological rehabilitation when the sound ripped the stillness apart. Not the vague shouting she had grown used to, but a raw, tortured howl as if someone were being brutally assaulted. And she jolted upright with her heart racing, listening to the ragged gasps, the sound of fists slamming into the wall, then a voice calling out in Italian, "Papa, Papa," over and over again with the desperate plea of a child crying for help. And Elena stood outside her bedroom door with her hands clenched into fists, telling herself this was not her concern, that he was a mafia boss, the man who held her captive, a man who could kill her whenever he wished, that she should not care, should not interfere, should not let herself become involved any more than necessary. Yet the screaming did not stop. It stretched on in despair, and Elena remembered the nights when Sophia was small and plagued by nightmares after their parents died, crying and calling Elena's name until she was held and sung back to sleep. And without thinking further, her feet carried her to Dominic's door before her mind could stop her. She pushed it open to find it unlocked, the darkness inside lit only by city light, seeping through sheer curtains. Dominic sprawled across the massive king-size bed, his body twisting as if fighting an unseen enemy, sweat soaking his black hair and silk sleep shirt, his face contorted in pain, both hands clawing at the air as though trying to push someone away. Italian spilling from his mouth in broken phrases Elena could not understand but whose terror she could feel, and she climbed onto the bed without thought, as if her body were acting on a caregiving instinct carved into her blood, lying down behind him and wrapping her arms around his trembling body, whispering as she once had to Sophia that it was all right, only a nightmare, that she was there, that he was safe now and nothing could hurt him. And for a brief moment Dominic's body seemed to soften beneath her hold, his breathing slowing, and Elena thought he would drift back to sleep. But then he woke, one instant still trapped in the dream, the next with eyes snapping open, wild like a cornered animal, and his hand clamped around Elena's throat before she could react, crushing her airway with fingers like steel as his eyes looked through her without recognition, still seeing an enemy instead of her. And Elena did not struggle, knowing that resistance would only trigger his instinct to tighten his grip. So instead she met his gaze, placed her hand over the back of the hand, choking her, and whispered with the last of her breath that it was her, Elena. And after 1 second, then another, the madness in Dominic's eyes ebbed, replaced by recognition and then horror, and he released her as if burned, scrambling back until his spine hit the headboard, while Elena coughed violently with her hands at her throat, forcing air back into her lungs, knowing bruises would bloom there by morning, but not caring, sitting there breathing and looking at Dominic as he stared at her with an expression she had never seen on the face of this cold mafia lord, fear not of her but of himself, asking hoarsely what she was doing there. And Elena swallowed against the burn in her throat and answered honestly that he had been screaming and she thought he needed someone, and silence fell over the dark room, broken only by their breathing and the distant sound of traffic, as Dominic looked down at the hand that had nearly killed her, and then back up at her with a look Elena could only describe as shattered, stating not in apology but in blunt fact that he had almost killed her. And Elena nodded slowly and said she knew, but that he had not. And when he told her she should leave, she heard what he did not say, that he was afraid he might hurt her again, that he did not trust himself. Yet she did not rise, instead lying down on the other side of the bed at an arm's length distance and staring at the ceiling, telling him calmly she would stay until he fell asleep again, that if the nightmare returned he would hear her voice and know he was safe. And Dominic said nothing, only watched her in the darkness as she felt the turmoil in his mind, the struggle between sending her away and letting her stay, until at last he did neither, simply lying back with eyes open and breathing evenly, the arm's length between them like an invisible wall neither dared cross. And Elena did not know when she drifted off. But when she opened her eyes, morning sunlight flooded the room, and Dominic slept deeply beside her, his face peaceful in a way she had never seen. And for the first time in many years, the most feared mafia boss in New York had slept through the night without a single nightmare. After that night, everything between them changed in a subtle way that defied easy definition, because Dominic never mentioned Elena entering his room, never apologized for nearly strangling her, yet he no longer treated her like a soulless tool either, and the therapy sessions began to fill with strange stretches of silence. No longer the cold silence between master and subordinate, but the quiet of two people trying to understand one another without knowing where to begin, until 1 week after the nightmare, during an ordinary afternoon massage, Dominic spoke without warning, saying his father had been murdered when he was 27, shot 17 times right in front of him while he could do nothing but stand there, his voice flat as if recounting someone else's life. And Elena stopped her hands with her fingers resting lightly on his wrist, where his pulse beat faster than usual, saying nothing and simply listening, knowing some wounds needed witness more than comfort, as Dominic continued that his father had taught him weakness meant death, that a Don never cried, never trembled, never let anyone see fear, that he had lived by that rule for 37 years, and now his body had betrayed him, lifting his right hand to watch it tremble faintly in the amber light, and calling it bitterly ironic that the butcher of Brooklyn could no longer hold a gun steady. And Elena looked into his eyes, and for the first time, saw not ruthless coldness, but the deep loneliness of a child, forced to grow up too fast. And she found herself speaking softly, saying her parents had died when she was 16 in a highway accident, alive 1 second and gone the next, the police call coming at 11 that night and her life never being the same again. And Dominic's gaze softened slightly as he asked how old her sister had been. 8, Elena replied, explaining that Sophia had not understood why their parents never came home, and that she had learned to be an adult while learning how to explain death to a child, adding quietly that she had never learned how to cry after that night, realizing only then that they were sharing scars both had hidden from the world. And after a long pause, Dominic said his mother had left when he was 5, unable to endure life in the family, present one day and gone the next, without goodbye or letter, his father forbidding her name to be spoken, and teaching him that people could love and abandon without looking back. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable but intimate, the silence of two people truly seeing one another for the first time, beyond the masks of mafia boss and impoverished waitress, recognizing shared wounds that would never fully heal. And 2 weeks later, Dominic unexpectedly insisted on accompanying Elena to visit Sophia, dismissing her surprise with the cold explanation that he needed to inspect his investment, though she knew it was only a pretext. And at the hospital, Elena watched him stand by the door as she cared for her sister, his expression unreadable, while Sophia, unaware of who the tall man in the expensive suit was, spoke brightly of her dreams, saying she wanted to study medicine and become a doctor to help people like herself, that Elena had once wanted to be a nurse but quit school for her sake, so she had to succeed to make her sister proud, and Dominic said nothing beyond a small nod. Yet Elena noticed how he looked at her while Sophia spoke of her sacrifices, not with the gaze of an owner assessing a tool, but of a man reconsidering everything he thought he knew. And on the drive back, he was unusually quiet, with his eyes on the window and his right hand resting steadily on his thigh. And when they returned to the penthouse, he went straight into his study and closed the door. And Elena did not know what he did there until 3 days later, when Tony handed her an envelope containing a letter from Columbia University, informing her that Sophia Cross had been awarded a full 4-year scholarship to the pre-medical program beginning the following fall after her recovery. And Elena stared at the letter before looking toward Dominic's study, where he was once again meeting with dangerous men as usual, knowing he would never mention it, never wait for thanks, never want her to know what he had done. Yet she knew, and for the first time she wondered whether beneath the icebound exterior of the mafia boss there was still a heart capable of beating. 1 month after Elena stepped into Dominic Valentino's penthouse, she no longer recognized herself, having grown accustomed to luxury, to sleeping on silk sheets and bathing in hot water, to no longer worrying about the next meal or the rent bill. Yet what frightened her more was that she had grown accustomed to him, to the long conversations that unfolded during massage sessions, to the meals she cooked that he silently finished to the last bite, to the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, and that night in the living room flooded with candlelight that Elena had lit because a storm had knocked out the power. She was performing the final therapy of the day, her fingers pressing familiar pressure points along Dominic's arm, his tremor now significantly reduced compared to a month earlier, though not entirely gone. Dominic sitting on the sofa with eyes half closed, his body yielding beneath her hands in a way he never allowed anyone else to see. the golden candlelight dancing across his face and softening the hard angles until, in that moment, he no longer resembled the butcher of Brooklyn but simply a weary man searching for a sliver of peace. When suddenly Dominic's hand closed around Elena's wrist and she looked up to meet his eyes, finding something there she had never seen before, not cold calculation but a smoldering fire, dangerous and full of promise, as he asked in a voice velvet, soft yet taut as a wire about to snap, why she was not afraid of him when everyone else was. And Elena felt the warmth of his hand seep into her skin, her heart racing so fast, she feared he could hear it, whispering that it was because she had seen him tremble, and people did not fear what they understood, the distance between them shrinking until Elena no longer knew who moved first, or whether both were drawn together like celestial bodies locked in a fated orbit, feeling his breath on her lips, carrying the scent of whiskey and sandalwood as his eyes closed and his face tilted down, only for Dominic to stop abruptly as if doused with cold water, releasing her wrist, rising, turning his back with the rigid stillness of a statue, warning her not to make that mistake, his voice once again cold as ice as he said he was not a good man, and she should never forget that. Disappearing down the darkened hallway, and leaving Elena alone amid flickering candles, clutching the hand still warm from his touch and realizing she felt disappointment, a feeling she had no right to feel, understanding with dread that she was falling into hell, into the very man who held her captive, a terror deeper than any threat he had ever spoken, and that night Elena could not sleep, lying awake staring at the ceiling with her heart still out of rhythm and her mind spinning with thoughts she dared not name, until around 2 a.m. she heard voices drifting from Dominic's study, the low rumble of several men arguing, knowing she should not eavesdrop, because in this world knowing too much meant death. Yet her feet carried her toward the partially open door where Dominic's icy voice cut through the air, saying there was a mole in the organization, feeding information to Salvatore, that his uncle knew about every shipment, every meeting, even his schedule, and that if he did not find the rat first, he would be killed, followed by an older, trembling voice suggesting the problem might not be internal but closer to him. The heavy silence that followed, broken by Dominic's dangerously low question asking what Tony was implying, and Tony Russo answering slowly and carefully that he implied nothing, only that Dominic had brought a stranger into his home, someone who knew his condition, someone with a sister whose life he was financing, and that anyone wishing to buy her loyalty would have ample leverage, as Elena recoiled with blood turning to ice, realizing they suspected her, and in this world suspicion was as lethal as guilt, with only one punishment for an informant, death. Returning to her room on shaking legs, closing the door, sitting on the bed with the horrifying awareness that she stood on the edge, having allowed herself to forget the truth, to forget this was a cage, to forget he was a mafia boss who could kill her at any moment, to forget she was never safe. And now she had to find a way to protect herself and Sophia without knowing how, when the enemy might be the very man she was beginning to trust. 1 week after the night Elena overheard the meeting, she was in the middle of her weekly supervised video call with Sophia when her sister proudly showed her a new gift, lifting her wrist toward the camera with eyes shining like a child on Christmas morning, and saying that someone had sent her a beautiful silver bracelet with a card wishing her a speedy recovery but no sender's name, guessing it must be some anonymous benefactor, and the blood in Elena's veins froze instantly as she stared at the gleaming silver bracelet on her sister's thin wrist. Every survival instinct she had honed over 12 years, screaming that something was wrong, because in the world she now lived in, nothing was accidental, and anonymous gifts to the sister of a woman living in a mafia boss's house were never coincidence, telling Sophia to take it off and keep her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest, insisting she remove it and not wear it again until Elena came, brushing aside Sophia's confusion and protests. And the moment the call ended, Elena ran to find Dominic, not caring whether he was in a meeting or not, flinging open the door to his study without knocking, and startling 4 men around the table into reaching for their guns, until Dominic's thunderous glare shifted when he saw the terror in her eyes, and he signaled them to lower their hands, asking what was wrong. Elena breathlessly explaining that Sophia had received an anonymous silver bracelet with no name, and that she believed something was wrong. Dominic rising at once as his irritation turned to sharp alertness in a heartbeat, and ordering Tony to send men to the hospital immediately and retrieve the bracelet without allowing anyone else to touch it. And 20 minutes later the silver bracelet lay on Dominic's desk, beneath harsh light as Tony returned with a technical specialist, a thin man with thick glasses who scanned the bracelet with a small device before announcing tensely that it contained a miniature military-grade GPS tracking chip, capable of following the wearer's movements down to the meter, and that, there was something else as well. Pausing before revealing a listening microphone transmitting anything spoken within a 5-meter radius, and Elena felt her legs weaken as she leaned against the wall to keep from collapsing, realizing someone had been tracking Sophia, listening to every conversation, knowing her exact location, and she knew who it was before Dominic spoke the name, roaring Salvatore with his right hand clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles blanched, turning to Tony with a fury Elena had not seen since the first night at the restaurant, and saying his uncle knew about Sophia, knew she was his weakness, and would use her as leverage or worse as a hostage to force submission, ordering Sophia moved immediately to a secret medical facility in New Jersey, known only to them with round-the-clock protection and no visitors without his direct authorization. Tony nodding and disappearing with astonishing speed, leaving Elena shaking uncontrollably. As for the first time since her parents died, she felt utterly powerless, turning to Dominic as tears finally broke free, and begging to be allowed to go with her sister because Sophia would be terrified and would not understand what was happening and needed her, only to be met with Dominic's cold refusal, that Elena must stay where he could protect her, because following Sophia would make her the next target and give Salvatore 2 pieces instead of 1. Elena breaking down completely and crying openly as she said Sophia was all she had, and that she could never forgive herself if anything happened to her sister because of this. And as Dominic watched her cry, something strange happened, his expression softening for a fleeting moment, as if a crack had appeared in the ice surrounding him, stepping closer until he stood directly before her and speaking not with cold authority, but with the weight of a vow, telling her he would protect Sophia, because Salvatore's move meant her sister was important, and Dominic Valentino never lost what was important, telling her to trust him, and Elena searched his dark eyes for deceit or calculation, and found only resolve, nodding slowly, not because she had any other choice but because in that moment she understood a terrifying truth, that she was placing the life of the person she loved most in the hands of a Mafia boss, and even more terrifying, she truly believed him. 3 days after Sophia was moved, Dominic left the penthouse to meet with allied bosses to reinforce his alliances before Salvatore could strike again. And before he went, he led Elena to a room she had never known existed, hidden behind a false wall inside the closet of his bedroom, telling her that if anything happened, she was to come here, and showing her how to open the door with a 6-digit code, explaining that inside there was water, food, and a backup gun, that the door was bulletproof and fire-resistant with its own ventilation system, and that she could survive there for 3 days without being found. And as Elena looked into the small, dimly lit space, a chill ran down her spine, because the very existence of such a room meant Dominic lived every day expecting an attack, always preparing for the worst, and he left 2 bodyguards to guard the penthouse before disappearing into the Manhattan night, while Elena tried to tell herself everything would be fine. But it was not, because that night at 11 o'clock, as Elena lay in bed reading to distract herself from worry about Sophia, the entire penthouse was suddenly plunged into darkness. The power cut not only to the lights but to the security system, the cameras, the alarms, and for one brief second she thought it was just a normal outage caused by a storm or technical failure until she heard gunshots, 2 shots fired in quick succession from the hallway, followed by 1 bodyguard's scream, and the crash of something like the front door being kicked in, and Elena leapt from the bed with her heart pounding wildly as survival instinct took over, not thinking but acting, running through the familiar darkness toward Dominic's bedroom, opening the closet, punching the code into the false wall with trembling fingers, the hidden door swinging open as she dove inside and slammed it shut just as she heard heavy footsteps entering the bedroom, a man's voice roaring for her to come out and calling her a whore, a voice she recognized at once as Marcus Valentino, Dominic's cousin and Salvatore's son, the brutal right hand she had heard named in whispered meetings. Marcus shouting about how obsessed his cousin was with her, pounding walls and kicking furniture, claiming he knew she was there and could smell her, demanding to see the bitch who had bewitched the butcher of Brooklyn, while Elena held her breath inside the safe room gripping the gun Dominic had left, never having fired a weapon in her life, yet knowing she would not surrender without a fight, listening as Marcus and his men tore through the penthouse, smashing everything while she counted seconds and prayed for rescue, until she heard gunfire from the stairwell, not the attackers' shots but return fire, fierce and precise, and Dominic's roar cutting through the chaos as he called Marcus out to face him. Elena, pressing her ear to the steel door, trying to understand what was happening, realizing Dominic had come back at the most dangerous moment instead of staying somewhere safe, and the firefight erupting in full fury with bullets slamming into walls, glass shattering, screams and cries of pain, Elena not knowing who was winning or how many enemies remained, only that outside this room was a fight for survival. And then she heard Dominic scream in agony, a sound so raw it felt like his body had been torn open, and Elena did not think because she could not think when she heard him in that kind of pain, her hand already moving to the keypad before her mind could stop it, knowing it was madness to go out there, knowing she could die, knowing she was only an ordinary woman holding a gun she did not know how to use, but also knowing she could not stay hidden while Dominic was wounded out there, not because he was her employer, not because he paid for Sophia, but for a reason she did not dare admit even to herself. And she entered the code. The safe room door opened, and Elena stepped into hell, the once luxurious penthouse now a battlefield of wreckage and shattered glass with the stench of gunpowder thick in the air, moonlight pouring through broken windows to reveal 2 bodies lying motionless near the front door. Attackers already down, though she did not know how many remained, following the sound of ragged breathing to find Dominic slumped against the wall near the sofa, one hand clutching his left shoulder where blood soaked through his white shirt, the other still holding a gun though it shook violently, his face pale as paper and slick with sweat, yet his black eyes burning with the focus of a man prepared to fight to his last breath. 3 more men advancing toward him from the hallway with Marcus at the front, gun in hand, and a crazed smile on his lips, mocking Dominic to shoot, sneering that he had forgotten Dominic could no longer shoot straight because his hand shook, calling the once feared butcher of Brooklyn a frightened dog, Dominic struggling to raise the gun as his right hand trembled so badly the barrel swayed like a reed in the wind, his left arm useless from the shoulder wound while the tremor betrayed him at the worst possible moment, and Elena standing in the shadows watching, knowing she had to do something, not a hero, but a survivor, whose life was now bound to his, tightening her grip on the gun and stepping out of the darkness. Elena did not know how to shoot a gun, but she knew how to survive, because 12 years of caring for Sophia, while working 3 jobs at once, had taught her that sometimes you did not need to be stronger than your enemy, only smarter, and she slipped back into the shadows with her eyes sweeping the wrecked penthouse, until she spotted what she needed, the fire alarm control panel near the kitchen, still operational because it ran on its own backup battery, moving like a shadow along the wall, carefully avoiding shattered glass that could give her away, while Marcus and his 2 men were fully focused on Dominic, convinced he was the only threat, never imagining that the thin former waitress was creeping up behind them. And when Elena reached the panel, she drew a deep breath and slammed her palm onto the activation button, the fire alarm shrieking instantly and ripping through the night as the sprinkler system burst to life, raining icy water from the ceiling, plunging the penthouse into chaos with blinding spray, deafening sirens, and visibility reduced to a swirling curtain of water, Marcus and his men spinning around in confusion for a split second, and Elena raised the gun and fired, not aiming at anyone in particular but toward the beam of a flashlight one of them held, the bullet smashing into the chandelier above and sending it crashing down with a horrifying clatter, firing again into a painting on the wall, then again into the sofa, hitting no one yet creating enough chaos for Dominic to surge forward, seizing the moment of distraction to shoot down the 2 henchmen with his injured left hand, each shot deliberate, precise, and fatal, 2 gunshots, 2 bodies collapsing, leaving Marcus alone, amid the artificial rain with his face twisted in fury. But Marcus was faster than Elena expected, not charging Dominic but whirling back toward the source of the shots, and before she could react, a brutal hand seized her hair and yanked her head back, a cold blade pressing tight against her throat as Marcus roared in her ear with breath hot and reeking of blood, ordering her to drop the gun and sneering that she thought she was a hero, calling her a whore, and promising to slit her throat in front of his beloved cousin. Elena releasing the gun as it clattered onto the wet floor, feeling the knife bite into her skin and draw a thin, burning line of blood across her neck, too afraid to breathe or move, reduced to a living shield, as Marcus dragged her into the center of the living room where the sprinklers still poured down, and Dominic stood about 5 meters away, blood streaming from his left shoulder down his arm and dripping onto the floor, his right hand shaking violently around the gun, Marcus laughing wildly with eyes gleaming like a demon's under the flashing red emergency lights, mocking the great butcher of Brooklyn for trembling like a frightened dog and declaring that his father had been right, that emotion had killed Dominic, that he was weak because of this woman, Dominic snarling for him to let her go, his voice ice cold, though Elena could hear something breaking beneath it, telling Marcus this was between the 2 of them, and not to drag others into it. Marcus laughing louder and echoing through the ruined penthouse, taunting Dominic for calling her someone else, when he had paid hundreds of thousands for her sister. Let her into his house, into his bed, into his heart, declaring she was not someone else but Dominic's greatest weakness, tightening his grip on Elena's hair and wrenching her head back to bare her throat beneath the blade, saying weakness must be eliminated and ordering Dominic to drop the gun or watch her die. Dominic standing there with water cascading down his ashen face, black eyes locked on Elena as if the world had narrowed to her alone, his right hand shaking uncontrollably, the gun swaying uselessly, and Elena knowing he could not shoot straight like this, knowing that if he tried he might hit her instead, understanding that his only option was to drop the gun and hope Marcus kept his word, a hope everyone knew was meaningless. And Elena met Dominic's gaze, saw the agony and desperation there, understood that he was ready to sacrifice himself for her, a woman he had known less than 2 months, and she could not allow it. The knife still pressed to her throat, Marcus still smiling in triumph, and Elena made a decision that would change everything. "Shoot," Elena said, her voice unnervingly calm amid the artificial rain and the shriek of the fire alarms. "Don't worry about me. Shoot," and Marcus burst into manic laughter that echoed through the shattered penthouse, telling Dominic that his whore wanted to die and that he would be happy to help her, tightening the knife until blood from the cut on Elena's neck began to flow more freely. Yet she never took her eyes off Dominic, staring straight into those deep black eyes, filled with pain and desperation, as she continued in a steady tone, as if delivering a sentence already decided. "Sophia needs you alive, Dominic. Shoot through me if you have to." And Dominic was so shocked that for a brief instant his hand stopped shaking, calling her insane in a hoarse voice, saying he could not because his hand could not shoot accurately like this and he might hit her, and Elena smiled, a strange smile in the face of death, repeating the words she had spoken to him on that candlelit night, whispering loudly enough to carry through the water and sirens that people do not fear what they understand, telling him he understood his tremor, and that instead of fighting it he should use it. And Dominic looked at her as if she had just handed him the key to a mystery that had tormented him for 4 months, looking down at his trembling hand and the gun swaying with its uncontrollable spasms, and for the first time, he did not try to suppress it, watching the tremor, counting its rhythm, realizing it followed a pattern, left, center, right, repeating in a cycle of about 2 seconds, and if he fired when the tremor brought the barrel to the exact point he needed, he could hit his target, the most reckless gamble of his life. Yet Elena had placed her life in his hands, and he had no other choice, while Marcus began to lose patience, roaring his countdown, threatening to slit her throat and send her head to his father. And Dominic closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, recalling the rhythm, feeling the barrel move left, center, right, opening his eyes at the precise moment the tremor brought it to center, aligned with Marcus's right shoulder protruding behind Elena, and he pulled the trigger, the gunshot booming like thunder as the bullet tore through the gunpowder heavy, rain-soaked air, grazing Elena's hair by mere centimeters, before slamming into Marcus's right shoulder, Marcus screaming in agony as his grip loosened in reflex, and Elena did not waste the moment, driving her elbow backward into his abdomen, twisting free from his weakening hold and sprinting toward Dominic, Marcus staggering back, clutching his bleeding shoulder with his face twisted in rage and pain, hissing that they would pay and that his father would kill them both, and Dominic stepped forward, gun still in hand. And this time his hand did not shake, not because the tremor had vanished, but because he had learned to accept it, to control it, to use it instead of being controlled by it, raising the gun and firing 2 more shots, one striking Marcus in the shoulder, and the other grazing his ribs, close to the heart but not fatal. Marcus Valentino collapsed onto the wet floor with disbelief frozen in his eyes, struggling briefly before shock overcame him and he lay motionless in a spreading pool of dark water. And Dominic staggered toward Elena, his left hand clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face pale as paper, and Elena rushed to catch him before he fell, wrapping an arm around his back and letting him lean into her, whispering through tears mixed with rain that he had done it, that he had made it, and Dominic looked at her, his black eyes dimmed by blood loss yet lit with something she did not dare name, telling her weakly that she had told him to shoot through her and that she truly was insane, and Elena laughed shakily through her tears, saying perhaps she was, but he had still hit his mark, as distant police sirens began to wail. Someone having raised the alarm, and they needed to leave immediately, Tony appearing from the stairwell with blood on his forehead and a gun in his hand, eyes sweeping the ruined penthouse, and the body of Marcus on the floor as he said the car was ready, and they had to go now. And Elena helped Dominic to his feet, letting him lean on her shoulder as they moved through the wreckage of what had once been a luxurious penthouse. Behind them, the fire alarms still screaming, the sprinklers still pouring down, and Marcus Valentino lying unconscious and bleeding out amid the chaos he had created. Yet Elena knew the war was not over, because Salvatore was still alive, and he would never forgive the death of his son. The cabin lay deep in the forests of northern New York, nearly 4 hours from the city, without an official address, and absent from any map or record, and Tony drove through the night while Elena sat in the back seat with Dominic's head resting on her thigh, his consciousness fading from blood loss as she pressed her coat firmly against the wound in his shoulder, feeling warm blood soak through the fabric and stick to her hands while she kept calling his name to keep him awake. And when they arrived, Dr. Nathan Cole was already waiting inside the small wooden cabin under dim yellow light. Medical instruments spread across the dining table, now turned into a makeshift operating table. A thin man in his 40s with hands that trembled from age but eyes sharp with focus. An underground doctor who had served the Valentino family for 20 years, and after a quick examination, he said the bullet was still lodged in the shoulder and had to be removed immediately, or infection would kill Dominic within days. But he had no anesthetic, only a small amount of morphine, not enough to fully numb the pain, and Elena looked at Dominic lying on the table, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and weak, her hand closing around his right hand that still trembled faintly even in unconsciousness. And she made her decision, telling the doctor she would hold him and that he should proceed, promising she would not let Dominic move. And though Dr. Cole looked doubtful, he had no time to argue, injecting a small dose of morphine into Dominic's arm, enough to dull but not erase the pain, and then cutting into the wound to reach the bullet, Dominic jerking awake with a scream that tore through the cabin as his body arched in agony when the scalpel sliced into flesh, his hand crushing Elena's so tightly she thought her bones would break. Yet she did not let go, climbing onto the table beside him, using her body weight to keep him still, and speaking to distract him from the pain, whispering close to his ear to focus only on her voice as sweat poured down his face, telling him she would share a dream she had never told anyone. And when the forceps went deeper into the wound and he growled through clenched teeth, squeezing her hand so hard she bit her lip to keep from crying out, she kept speaking in a steady, gentle voice, saying she had once wanted to be a pediatric nurse, to care for sick children, to hold newborns who had no one to hold them, to sing lullabies to orphans like herself and Sophia, a dream she had before her parents died, after which she no longer dreamed but merely survived one day at a time. And Dominic groaned with eyes shut tight, but he was listening. She knew because his grip loosened and turned into a desperate hold, as if she were the only anchor in a sea of pain, asking her to keep talking, and she told him about her parents, about evenings eating together in their small Queens home, about her father saying that having each other was enough even without much money, about the night of the accident and the call from the police and how she had learned to be an adult at 16, about Sophia, about how her sister still smiled despite relentless illness, about her dream of becoming a doctor, about the love that had kept Elena alive through years of hell. And as Dr. Cole worked to pull the bullet free, Dominic began to speak too, telling her about the night his father was killed, 17 bullets tearing into the man, while Dominic stood helpless watching him die second by second, about the loneliness of a 5-year-old abandoned by his mother, about never learning how to love because no one taught him, about the wall of ice he built around his heart so no one could ever hurt him again, whispering that he did not know what love was, only control, possession, conquest, but that with her he no longer knew what he was doing. And Elena lowered her forehead to his, her tears falling onto his cheek as she told him he was learning, that what he had done for Sophia and for her, what he had done by returning alone to the penthouse to save her, knowing he might die, that was love, and he had simply never named it. And when Dr. Cole finally pulled the bullet free with a metallic clatter, Dominic cried out once more before losing consciousness from exhaustion, and Elena stayed beside him through the night, her hand never leaving his, and for the first time in 12 years, she let herself cry freely. And the next morning when the first sunlight slipped through the cabin window, Dominic opened his eyes to see Elena asleep beside him, her head resting on her arm, her hand still gripping his as if afraid he might disappear, and he did not wake her, only watched her in the pale golden dawn, the drawn face marked by worry and sleeplessness and the dried tracks of tears on her cheeks, feeling something stir in his chest that he had believed long dead. And when Elena woke, she found him looking at her with eyes utterly changed, no longer cold or calculating, but holding a rough tenderness, as if he were learning how to open a heart he had sealed shut for 37 years, and he said nothing, only pulled her gently down beside him despite the pain in his shoulder, holding her close as they kissed for the first time. Not a kiss of desire or control, but of two broken souls, finding healing in each other, slow and gentle, as if both feared the moment would shatter if rushed. And when the kiss deepened and clothes fell to the cold cabin floor, and their bodies came together in the early morning light, Elena knew she had crossed a point of no return, and she felt no regret at all. 2 days after the night in the cabin, when Dominic's wound had begun to heal, and he could sit up without grimacing in pain, he called Elena to the table and laid out before her a plan he had been harboring for a long time, saying there was a way to end everything, his voice low and grave, explaining that there was a black ledger containing proof of every bribe, every dirty deal, every crime Salvatore had committed over the past 20 years, and that if he could get that ledger he could send the old man to federal prison for life without firing another shot. And Elena looked into his eyes and saw the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting for too long, asking where the ledger was, and Dominic told her it was in Henry Blackwood's office at the Obsidian Room, that Henry was Salvatore's inside man, and kept the book as insurance in case Salvatore ever turned on him, that there was a safe hidden beneath the wooden floor, the combination being his daughter's birthday, the 12th of November, 1988, and Elena felt her heart quicken as she understood what he was implying, telling him slowly that he could not go there, that he was being hunted by both the police and Salvatore's people. And Dominic nodded, the pain on his face not from the wound in his shoulder but from what he was about to say, admitting that Tony could not go either because his face was too well known, then stopping and looking at Elena with conflicted eyes, saying there was only one person left who knew the restaurant like the back of her hand, someone no one would suspect, someone invisible, and Elena understood at once, saying she would go before he could speak, and Dominic immediately objected, his voice sharpening as he said he had not told her so she would volunteer, and that he did not want to hide anything from her anymore. But he would not let her risk her life for his war, and Elena answered firmly that this was not only his war, that Salvatore had threatened Sofia, had sent people to kill her, had tried to destroy everything they had, and that this was her war as much as his, and they argued for an hour, Dominic growling and Elena refusing to back down, until at last he admitted what they both knew, telling her in a voice dragged up from the deepest part of him that he was afraid of losing her, that he had lost his father, his mother had left, and he did not know who he would become if he lost her too. And Elena stepped closer, placing her hand on his cheek and feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm, asking softly if he trusted her, and Dominic closed his eyes, leaned into her touch, and nodded, then gave her the safe combination, a hand-drawn map marking the exact location of the false floorboard, and a phone with a GPS tracker so he could follow her position, and at midnight Elena stood at the back door of the Obsidian Room, where she had once entered every night as an anonymous waitress, dressed in black from head to toe with her hair pulled tight and a small knife hidden in her boot that Tony had given her before she left, entering the door code she still remembered from her days working there and slipping inside in silence. The restaurant dark and empty with only pale green emergency lights casting ghost-like shadows on the walls, Elena moving like a shadow herself, avoiding the creaking floorboards she knew by heart, slipping through the kitchen and staff corridors until she reached Henry's office. The door unlocked either by carelessness or as a trap, but she had no other choice, stepping inside and catching the faint scent of Henry's cheap cologne still lingering in the air, finding the rug Dominic had described, pulling it aside to reveal the floorboard with a different joint, prying it up with her knife to expose the small black safe beneath, turning the combination with trembling fingers, 121188, hearing the soft click as it opened and pulling the door wide. Inside a thick black leather-bound ledger, and when she flipped through a few pages, she saw numbers, names, dates, recorded down to the last cent. Knowing this was it, the evidence that would bury Salvatore Valentino, slipping the book into her jacket, standing up, and turning for the door, only to crash straight into a wall of flesh as the lights snapped on in a blinding glare, and she squinted to see the man blocking her way. Salvatore Valentino himself, 62 years old, with white silver hair and eyes cold as a serpent, smiling venomously, flanked by two massive enforcers, and behind them, pale as a ghost and leaning heavily against the wall, stood Marcus Valentino. Elena's heart stopped as she remembered seeing Dominic shoot him, yet here he was, his chest and shoulder thickly bandaged beneath his jacket, his gaze promising savage revenge. Salvatore speaking in a voice smooth as velvet and cold as ice that he had known she would come, calling her a naive girl and saying she thought he did not know about the ledger, that he had been waiting there for 3 nights. Marcus stepping forward with his good hand clenched into a fist and punching Elena in the face before she could react, sending her crashing to the floor with blood filling her mouth as the ledger slipped from her jacket, Salvatore picking it up, flipping through a few pages, then looking down at her with contempt and asking where his foolish nephew was, telling her to speak, and he would let her die quickly. Elena spitting blood onto the floor and meeting the old Mafia boss's eyes, telling him he could kill her but she would not say a word, her voice shaking but not from fear. Salvatore studying her for a long moment before turning to Marcus and ordering him coldly to make her talk but not to kill her yet, saying he wanted Dominic to hear her scream before he slit her throat in front of him. Marcus grinning wide, and Elena knowing that true hell was only just beginning. Just as Marcus raised his hand to strike Elena a second time, gunfire erupted outside the restaurant. Not a single shot but a rapid barrage, bullets tearing through the air, screams echoing, glass shattering as Salvatore's guards fell into chaos. The front doors bursting open as Dominic Valentino stepped through the smoke like a god of vengeance returned from hell. Tony and 4 loyal bodyguards at his back with guns raised, having spotted Salvatore's ambush team on the perimeter just moments after Elena entered. Dominic standing there with his left shoulder still bandaged and his face pale from incomplete recovery, yet his eyes burned with a fire Elena had never seen before. And when he saw her on the floor with blood on her lips and her face swollen, the fury inside him surged like a volcano about to erupt, ordering Salvatore to release her in a voice cold as ice, yet trembling with restrained rage. Salvatore sneering as he dragged Elena upright and used her as a shield, a small gun pressed to her temple as he mocked his beloved nephew for arriving sooner than expected, and guessed that this woman meant more to him than he had thought. Marcus grinning beside his father despite the pain in his bandaged arm as he taunted Dominic to shoot and jeered that his hand still shook, and asked whether he dared risk hitting the woman he loved. Elena standing in Salvatore's grip with the cold muzzle against her head and feeling no fear. Having survived hell for 28 years and faced death more times than she could count, knowing this was not the end, remembering the knife hidden in her boot that no one had bothered to search for because they saw her as weak, slowly bending as if unsteady with fear and letting her fingers close around the handle, Dominic warning Salvatore in a low, dangerous voice to let her go and keep this between them, Salvatore laughing louder and accusing Dominic of weakness for letting her into his home, his bed, his heart, saying he was just like his father, and that was why he had killed him, and why he would kill Dominic too. Dominic ignoring the provocation and keeping his eyes on Elena. And in that look she read his message, that he trusted her, that he knew she would act, that he was waiting, and Elena struck in a lightning-fast motion, drawing the knife and plunging it backward into Salvatore's thigh, the old man screaming as his gun hand jerked aside, Elena twisting free in the same instant as Dominic fired without hesitation, the bullet slamming into Salvatore's gun shoulder and sending the weapon flying. Marcus charging with a feral roar, only for Tony to shoot twice, ensuring this time he would not get up, dropping him for the final time with 2 bullets straight to the heart, Salvatore collapsing to his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder and staring up at the nephew he had hunted for months, Dominic standing before him with the gun leveled and saying it was over and that he could kill him now just as Salvatore had killed his father, Salvatore spitting blood and daring him to prove he was a true Valentino. Dominic pausing with his finger on the trigger as Elena saw the battle in his eyes between the monster he had been taught to be and the man he was becoming, then lowering the gun and calmly saying no, that he would not kill him, that he would let him rot in federal prison for the rest of his life, waking each day to the humiliation that the nephew he despised had defeated him, not with violence but with the law, turning to Tony and ordering him cuffed, and the FBI called with the black ledger delivered before dawn, and 6 months later, the Obsidian Room reopened under new ownership and a completely different atmosphere. Salvatore Valentino sentenced to life without parole after the ledger reached federal authorities, and the criminal empire he built over 40 years collapsing like a sandcastle before the tide. Marcus not surviving that night and mourned by no one. Dominic Valentino, now an unchallenged boss who was steadily legitimizing his empire by withdrawing from violence and investing in real estate and finance, his right hand still trembling, especially when tired or stressed, yet no longer a source of shame. Sophia fully recovered after a successful kidney transplant, and now a first-year student at Columbia University on a full scholarship, never knowing who the man her sister loved truly was, and perhaps never needing to. Elena, resuming the nursing program she had abandoned 12 years earlier with a scholarship funded by an anonymous foundation whose source she knew well, and on the reopening night of the Obsidian Room, Dominic sat at the VIP table with a silver cane beside him as part of his new image, and waited, the doors opening as Elena entered, not in a worn waitress uniform, but in a vivid red dress that set off her hazel eyes, and the healthy glow of a woman who had finally been able to eat and sleep. No longer the exhausted, fragile girl with dark circles and frayed collars, but radiant, confident, and breathtaking. Sitting across from Dominic, and as a ritual now ingrained, she reached out and took his right hand, still faintly trembling, and squeezed it with all the tenderness she possessed, teasing him about the wine as her eyes sparkled. Dominic meeting her gaze, the same eyes he had seen on the first night, she dared step into his killing ground to save his dignity, and smiling a real smile few ever saw, saying the wine tasted of victory and of kindness and courage, and of a crazy waitress who dared take a monster's hand and never let go, lifting her fingers to his lips and kissing the hands that had held him through pain, cared for him when no one else dared, and saved his life with a gentleness his world had never known, calling her his queen, and she answering that he was her wolf as her smile shone like the sun, and beyond the windows New York glittered harsh and unforgiving as ever. Yet in this small corner of the restaurant, two people who had walked through hell to find each other had finally found peace, and the story of Dominic and Elena reminds us that in life, sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change destiny, that Elena had no gun, no power, no money, only a brave heart and the ability to see the human being behind the mask, teaching us that kindness is not weakness but the greatest strength we can possess. And Dominic, the ruthless mafia boss, proved that no one is a monster forever if someone is willing to see the good in them and believe in their capacity to change. And if you loved this story, please like and share it with those you care about so they can listen too. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a moving story. Tell us how this story made you feel, and whether in real life you have ever met someone who changed your life through a small but courageous act. We would love to hear your heartfelt thoughts in the comments, so we can connect and spread positivity together. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and happiness every day. Always believe that no matter how hard life becomes, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. If we never give up hope, goodbye and see you again in the next video.